Well, we're delighted that you're here.
I only come to see you.
Well, you all know that who you're here waiting for, and we don't need to say it was nice that you came, because we know why you came. And so we enjoy to start today's program.
Rick Kogan, here we go.
One of the reasons I love Betty is they are the shortest introductions in the world. And sometimes whenever I don't do these things as much as I used to, I think because...
We're glad you still are.
What, honey?
Yeah.
She's glad you still do.
Well, I do this one. But there are some times where people will begin these things with, Rick Kogan was born in 1941 in Old Town. And at that point, I literally want to blow my brains out. What we decided, Betty and all of us, is to do a kind of thing about Studs Terkel. You want me to do that? Yeah. Studs was incredibly influential in my life. He is the guy who took my dad out the night I was born for cocktails. When my daughter Fiona was born 13 years ago, I kept waiting for someone to come. I said, what happened to this ritual? This is a cool... No one came to take me out for cocktails, and I went out by myself. And what I learned there, my talks are all over the map. What I learned, Fiona was born at Northwestern Hospital, and I walked over by myself to Eli's, the old place for steak, this great fancy restaurant on Chicago Avenue. And I sat there and said, give me a Jim Beam on the rocks. And I had one, and I had another. And I was just smiling to myself. And some guy said, are you celebrating something? I said, yeah, I am. I just had a daughter. Buy this man all the drinks he wants. And I thought, my God, for these 50 years before that, I could have gotten free drinks by just going to a strange but nice bar and saying, hey, how are you? And I go, hey, how are you? I go, I'm great, I just had a daughter. Don't you think that I could have saved? I could be retired now, frankly. So Studs was very influential in my life. One of the cool things about being here for you guys on Tuesday, I think it's Tuesday the 16th or Wednesday the 16th. On the 16th of May, the Studs Terkel archive is going to go live. It's going to be free. It means that any one of you can go to WFMT / just Google search Studs Terkel archive, and you will have immediate and free access to 5,000 hour-long interviews that he did. You can listen to the one of Mike Royko and my father breaking into Studs' studio and taking over his show on the day that Division Street America was published. You can hear Studs. I have not listened to all of them, but I listen to maybe one a day now. Studs interviewing the 23-year-old Bob Dylan, who is certifiably the strange Dylan that he is today. It is the same voice, it's the same this, and Dylan had just come out with his second album, as we used to call them, and the charming part of the beginning of the show is Studs, when I read Studs, I'm not gonna imitate him, but I'll imitate him now. He goes, he introduces Bob Dylan by saying, yes, in the studio, the man looks like Huckleberry Finn, if Huckleberry Finn were alive today. His name is Bob Dylan, and he's a poet. So they talk a little while, and the Studs goes, now Bob, could you maybe play a song for me? And Dylan is so thinking, well, you could play it off the disc there to sound a lot better. And said, no, I'd like to watch you play. Well, on the disc, it'll be a lot better. The great part of the show is he browbeats Dylan into playing live on the radio. And it's just fantastic. So that's something to think about. Studs Terkel Archive is going to be live. And he interviewed everybody. I'm going to start, if it's okay with you guys. You want to hear like a 4-minute thing with Studs and Sidney Poitier. It's pretty cool. Let's hope that I can do this. Alt Control delete. You see, I am inept with computers, and Studs used to pretend to be inept with tape recorders so that he could get everyone he was talking to like help him, be nice to him. Here is a little bit of Studs Terkel interviewing Sidney Poitier. It's only 4 minutes.
Why did you want to become an actor? What is it about acting?
Well, I think there is that about acting that affords me an expression that I couldn't find anywhere else. I sometimes like to think of myself as not very, I'm a pretty emotionally stirred up dude, you know, and I need a great many releases. And as Western civilization becomes more mechanized, I need additional outlets too. And acting at the time, when I was 17, 18 years old, acting offered me an area where I could be an exhibitionist, where I could give vent to some of my frustrations, where I could pour out some of my confusion and other ills into a fictitious character.
As well as your strengths too,
Yes,
if I may.
such as they were.
Such as they are.
Thank you. And I used the theater, I used acting and acting classes as a therapy. I would go there after working in the garment district or any other of the 14, 18 places I did work. I would go to class at night and I would sit and study and do scenes and read. And I thought, you know, that this is something that gives me a badge of distinction. I can be many things here. And the areas of life, socially and otherwise, that were then restricted to me, I had ways of retaliating in this kind of illusion, you know.
You can be many things, you said, which leads to, I think, to a point here. Obviously, the defiant one is an adult film. You've been in 2 remarkably adult films. The treatment here of the Negro not as the old-fashioned stereotype, not the porter, not always the bootblack or the kowtower, but as a human being. And this leads to a question. Have you thought of the idea, and this has occurred, the late Canada Lee played Caliban in The Tempest. We read of the tremendous Negro actor of a century or more ago, Ira Aldridge, who played Shakespeare. Has the thought of playing a role, a person who is not necessarily Negro, just an actor, he is neither Negro nor white, just a certain character, has this thought occurred to you or come into your ken?
Oh, of course it has. I play Negro parts because this is the period in history when I must play Negro parts. I think that in 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20 years, there will come a time when there will be more stress on merit and on creative ability than on the than is paid now. Now we give credence to casting according to type. You see, and we do this primarily, I think, because we don't have a standard, a real standard in the American theater. Had we a standard in the American theater, as for instance they have somewhat of a standard in England and other European countries, the actor, regardless of his origin, once he is developed to a point where he can compete on a certain professional level, then his talent is employed, not what he represents socially or what he looks like. Or the place he may have in the society. his talent is employed, and if that talent is found in an Egyptian, or if it is found in an American Indian, I see no reason why an American Indian cannot play Shakespeare if he happens to be a tremendous Shakespearean actor. You follow?
Well,
You know what strikes me about that, among many things, and it's from 1959, is that you just, you are not likely to hear a conversation like that on any radio station I know. You're rather to get, hey, love your show, what's the weather going to be tomorrow? Do you know what I mean? This is what makes, and as you dip into the archives, you will realize, I mean, you could name a figure of the last part of the 20th century, and I guarantee you, they sat for an hour with Studs Terkel talking about meaningful things. That's 4 minutes of the Terkel thing. Want me to read some stuff? I put together a bunch of stuff, random stuff. I also have some more studs on the radio. I have some studs on TV, and I have some photos too, because I'm now a computer expert. And as always, for those of you who've ever been to one of these so-called shows before, you can stop at any time and ask me any question you want about anything. No, I haven't seen the new offices of the Tribune. We're moving, as you know, from the tower to the Prudential building. It is my understanding that my cubicle now that has about 300 books in there is going to be, and I'm not kidding you, about the size of this desk. Because the geniuses think that we'll be more collaborative. And the geniuses have run this paper into what they've run this paper into. I'm going to read something that, these are all sort of, some of them are excerpts. Studs wrote a lot of books. One of his favorite books of mine is a book called Just Chicago. I'm sure you have it here at the library. It's about the city and it's about him. He writes in that book, he writes about his great friend and my father's too, Nelson Algren. He writes about Nelson's City on the Make. And he then writes, Chicago forever keeps two faces. One is for winners, one for losers, one for hustlers and one for squares, one for go-getters and one for get-it-yourselfers, one for poets and one for promoters, one for early risers, one for evening hiders. Studs continues, it is the city of Jane Addams, settlement worker, and Al Capone, entrepreneur, of Clarence Darrow, lawyer, and Julius Hoffman, judge, of Louis Sullivan, architect, and Sam Insull, tycoon, of John Altgeld, governor, and Patty Bowler, alderman. Patty is the one who some years ago observed, Chicago ain't ready for reform. But Chicago, Studs writes, is America's dream, writ large and flamboyantly. Chicago is not the most corrupt of cities. Chicago, though, is the big daddy. Not more corrupt, just more theatrical and more colorful in its shadiness. He then writes about Marshall Field, the first, the merchant prince. 1886, the fight for the 8-hour day had begun. Anarchists, largely German, were in the middle of it. A mass meeting, a bomb is thrown, nobody knows who did it. There's a trial, the Haymarket 8 were in the dock, and the verdict was guilty. Before 4 of them were executed, there's a worldwide campaign for a touch of mercy with a number of Chicago's most respected industrialists in support. Hold off the hangman and give them life. But it was Marshall Field the first who saw to it that they swung, hang the bastards. Later in the book, and Studd was all over the place when he wrote and did things, he just wrote this. Sparrows are always the most abundant of our city birds. It is never a glory time for them. As always, they do the best they can, which isn't very much. They forever peck away and in some way survive the day. Who said life was fair? They hope, as the old spiritual goes, that his eye is on all the sparrows and that God watches over them and you and me. in one of his books, he interviews a guy, Sergeant Tom Carney. And this is, 30, 40 years ago, but just in terms of what's going on in the city, especially between police and going on across the nation, this is really something. Studs writes, I think it's something. Studs writes, I buy him a drink and he buys me one. And then he says, each child has a dream. I had two. One was to be a Marine, the other was to be a policeman. I tried out other endeavors, but I wasn't really cut out for it. I'm a policeman. It's the most gratifying job in the world. But look at me. I'm human. I make mistakes like everybody else. If you want a robot, build machines. If you want a human being, here I am. I don't think any person doing my job could face the stuff I face without losing your temper. I've used the N-word. I've used the word stump jumping hillbilly. I've used every vulgarity against them. It depends on the element. I never studied psychology, but I apply it every day. You want to know what a Chicago policeman is? Good cannon fodder. I'm the element that stands between the legitimate person and the criminal. I don't believe in killing everybody, but I do believe we've gone overboard. They can shoot a guy like crazy, we cannot retaliate. I'm a target for those kind of people. Go ahead, vent yourself. That's what I'm here for, a whipping boy. I'm not saying life is violent, but I deal in the violent part of life. And any Chicago cop could have said that yesterday, don't you think?
When was that written?
Oh, I'd say 40 years ago. Studs also could be amusing about life in general and how it came to him in that very same book. And again, when you rush out and check out the book so no one else can get it. It's just called Chicago. It's very slim, and it's like the real Studs, because most of his other books are the compilations of the interviews. A famous oral historian. A few months ago, I had trouble with the corner. Studs was not good with any kind of machines. A few months ago, I had trouble with the corner newspaper vending machine. I dropped my quarter in for the morning trib. It was the fourth quarter in a month I had lost to this mechanized predator. I kicked it hard, again and again. I rammed my foot against it. I cursed it out loud, and that's when she came along. I had seen this bag lady several times before, as she was hard to miss. Ageless, she tipped the scales at hardly more than 100 pounds, with 2 burlap bags probably outweighed her. She wore 2 coats, whether it was 10 below or 90 above. She belonged. I gave the damnable monster one last whack, brushing my hand badly. I still have the scar. She joined me. She took over, banged it with her elbow, her shoulder, her knee, and with the exhilarating fury of her whole being, once, twice, and 3 times. And then there was a rattling, as if from a dying dragon, and the quarters flew out, overflowing the slot, a Las Vegas jackpot. I plunked out my 4 quarters. She scooped up the rest. She went her way. I went mine. Not a word was exchanged between us, not even a glance. Yet we were kindred spirits. Isn't that, I mean, that is Studs', and I'm trying to give you a sense in all this stuff I'm showing and doing. Is kind of what the kind of guy he was, a guy who was connected to the most famous people in the world, but also felt connected to the so-called ordinary people. Here he is writing about Division Street, which was in 1967. It was not his first book. His first book was a thing called Giants of Jazz, which he wrote in the 50s. In 1967, he came out with Division Street. The idea was born out of Studs had been doing the radio show for, I don't know, then about a decade. And there was a publisher in New York who would send authors to Chicago, and he kept hearing from him, God, there's this fascinating guy who has an hour-long radio show. He wants to talk about everything. He can't stop talking. And one of the things, everybody thinks Studs was the world's greatest listener. When you listen to some of these archive things, you'll say to yourself at some point, I guarantee you'll say, shut up, Studs, let the person talk. He was a great talker. He was trained as an actor. He was also a lawyer, though he never practiced for one day. God, he would have been a strange lawyer. So the publisher, Andre Schifrin, came to Chicago and said, why don't you put together a sort of collection of your radio interviews? And Studs didn't want to do that. He said, that's too easy. It's too easy. So he decided to interview a bunch of people. This is some of what he wrote about why he wrote Division Street. And also on the Studs archives, as I said, is the hilarious Herman Kogan, my dad, and Mike Royko, who you all know, literally taking over Studs' show. And most of what Studs does there is giggle during the whole thing. Is there a street in Chicago where all manner of ethnic, racial, and income groups live? There is none. The nomadic, transient nature of contemporary life diffused the order or disorder of the city, not to mention what happened with Bulldozer and the Wrecking Ball. It came down to individuals, no matter where they lived. Being neither a sociologist or a research man, I followed no blueprint or statistics. I played hunches and long shots. Irvin Cobb once said, all horse players die broke. Here's one who will die astonished. That's a great line. I was on the prowl for a cross-section of urban thought, using no one method or technique. Accident and improvisation played as much a part in the making of this book as any plan. I had an idea of the kind of people I wanted to see. Homeowners, homemakers, landladies, project dwellers, skilled hands, the young. I was out to swallow the world. My world was my city. What with the scattering of the species, it had to be in the nature of guerrilla journalism. I realized quite early in this adventure that interviews conventionally conducted were meaningless. The question and answer technique may be of value in determining favorite detergents, but not in the discovery of men and women. It was simply a case of making conversation and listening. Talk of childhood invariably opened up the sluice gates of dammed up hurts and dreams. There were key questions asked idiomatically. The themes were their profession and their human concern. It should be made clear that a number of people in this book are highly literate. They're merely non-celebrated, that's all. As for articulateness, each person found it in his or her own way, and in his or her own good time. And passions run deep. Here he talks about the tape recorder. We come now to the role of the tape recorder. When it went wrong, which happened a number of times, I just swore at it. During each of these instances, my companion laughed and seemed to feel more relaxed. I have never been able to drive a car, ride a bicycle, roller skate, swim, dance, or engage in any such form of coordinated activity. I'm going to stop there just for a second to tell you a great story. And again, anytime you want to say, what does that mean? Or tell me more about this. Studs was, because the film director, John Sayles, was a huge fan of Studs and his work, he cast Studs in 8 Men Out. Remember that movie? Good movie about the Black Sox scandal of 1919. And Studs played a reporter. And so they were filming all over town, and one afternoon, Studs came to Ricardo's, which was a bar at Rush and Hubbard, where my parents met, and actually where my parents first met Studs in the late 40s after the war. And I was sitting there having a drink, and Studs came in, and he was very excited. He's wearing a snap, he's in a movie costume, and a snap brim hat. And I go, Studs, how's this going? How's the movie going? Is it fun? Ah, Rick, it's incredible. It's incredible. I get paid more money than I've ever made for anything. Just like to say a few words. I go, well, what did you do today? Rick, the best day ever. The best day ever. I was supposed to get in a car and drive half a block. And I go, but you don't drive. That's it. That's why it was so great. I had to have a stunt driver. A stunt driver. Isn't that great? His name was Bill. He's a stunt man. This was the easiest stunt he ever had to do. So when you see the film, if you see it again, or you'll see somewhere in there Studs getting in a car and it's a stunt driver. Who has stories like that? A stunt driver. So he's talking about the tape recorder. Yet, paradoxically, without my mechanical ally, none of my books, without the tape recorder, would have been possible. There is such a thing as base ingratitude, even to a machine. The locales of the encounters were varied. There's 71 stories here in Division Street, with multiple stories inside. We may have been in the home of a subject, or in his place of work, or a quiet corner of a radio studio, or the front seat of a car. On occasion, there was coffee, or a can of beer, or a shot of whiskey, or, in the case of a gracious elderly woman, a memorable meal. She said, even cooking can taste like love. It's a great line. We move on then to, you want to see, what do you want to see? You want to see something? All right. Yes. And if I start beating or kicking this machine, stop me. Ask me a question, I can talk and type at the same time.
What's your password? No.
What?
What's your password?
What's my password? This wouldn't get you much.
How is Studs' goddaughter doing?
Pardon me?
How is Studs' goddaughter doing?
Well, she's not really formally his goddaughter. She's doing very well. We're talking about, well, I'll show you a picture. You want to see a picture?
Sure.
And some of you have seen this picture before because it is, I hazard to say, my favorite picture in the world. Here it comes, I think. I'll tell that story. Many of you have heard this story, right, about Studs and his heart operation on that jazz. Yes? No? Want to hear it again? Sure. So my mother, who was about Studs' age, and they had been friends forever. My father died a long time, when he was 75. She calls me one afternoon and says, I've got some terrible, terrible news. I go, what's the matter, Mom? Studs has to go in for a heart operation. And I said, Jesus, well, what happened? Well, nothing happened. He just wants a heart operation. Okay, Mom. So I call Studs and say, Studs, it's Rick. Rick, I gotta go under the knife. Under the knife, do you hear me? And I go, yeah, Mary Lou told me, but why do you have to go under the knife? Rick, he was then 93 years old. If I don't do this, I only got 6 months to live. And I'm thinking, if someone told me right now I only had 6 months to live, I'd say, okay, I'll take the deal. I'll take it. He's 93. I was thinking, what doctor could possibly guarantee tomorrow? I go, well, how did you decide this? Well, last week Quentin was over. Quentin Young, being his longtime personal physician and a great Chicago activist, was over. And we decided. And I'm thinking to myself, I get in my mind the image of these two 90-something guys sitting around having martinis and deciding instead of playing basketball, maybe Studs should have a heart operation. And I go, are you really? So I talked to Quentin, I talked to some other people. He had really decided to do it. He was not feeling well. He was not feeling himself. His body was mistreating him. So he's going to go in, and I realized that my 2-year-old Fiona had never met her grandfather, but never met her grandfather's best friend. So one Sunday afternoon, I went over and took Fee, and Fee, you guys all know what a 2-year-old's like. You're not like, hello, Mr. Turkle, how are you? So Studs, in classic fashion, takes her out of my arms and goes, Fiona, it's so great to meet you. You look just like my favorite Irish actress, Fiona McEntee. And Fiona's like, So we go in, and Fee is sitting on Studs' knee, and for the next hour, he starts telling her stories, many of which I have heard. Now, Fiona, did your dad ever tell you about the time Mike and your grandfather took over the radio show? It was fantastic. They did this and this. Now, Fiona, did your dad ever tell you about the time we were at Ricardo's with Nelson Ogren? And Fiona just like, In one way, the perfect audience for Studs. In one way, because she is just, and I've realized, I've seen this picture 1,000 times, but Studs in his red check shirt, you see the rubber bands around his hand, he always had those to, put them on books and stuff. The pens in his pocket. That Studs, and the white hair, Studs was literally like a human doll for Fiona. It's like, and that voice too. So then he's saying, Fiona, your grandmother Mary Lou, she was once the most beautiful woman in the newspaper business. She's a little nutty. She's a little nutty. So you're gonna have to be nice to her. And Fiona's like, So at one point, his caretaker, full-time caretaker, JR, came out, and I said, Studs, we gotta go. You're going to the hospital tomorrow, for Christ's sake. And he goes, Rick, there's a 50% chance that I'll check out. And that was his euphemism for death. He's a hotel kid. Check out, checking out, checked out. Rick, let's have one last taste. And I'm thinking, taste of what? So JR comes out with 2 shots of scotch, and Fiona is still, he doesn't move. And we come out, we have the drink. The ex-wife is there with and it wasn't even a phone camera, just like a regular cheap Instamatic or whatever that we used to use in the olden days. She came out and said, can I get one picture? One of the reasons this picture is a miracle to me is there was just one picture. That was the only picture. It wasn't part of a long photo shoot or anything. This was it. This was it. And what is happening in this picture is they are both. Studs was sitting there going, now Fiona, I had a 50% chance I could check out tomorrow. And Fiona's like, And if I don't see you, I want you to grow up to be healthy, and I want you to grow up to be kind. And I want you, and he starts pointing like this, to grow up in a city. You just point to a blank wall. A city where no one goes hungry, where everybody has a decent place to live. That's what I want for you. That's what I want for you. Snap, goodbye, we go. Literally one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. I don't know if she likes looking at this picture, but it's like, now who is that guy again? I have not imitated it. Maybe she could have some memory if I start imitating Studs. So Studs goes in the hospital the next day. He undergoes a 6-hour operation. He had a double bypass when he was 85. This was a redo of that bypass, and why not add 3 more for, extra money or something, so a quintuple bypass. I had heard from the hospital that he had survived the operation, and Studs was a very frail guy. I mean, he literally, not driving a car, Studs never exercised on any conceivable level, nothing, 0. Great friend Mike Royka was a softball player and was something of an athlete, but not Studs. So I call him day after the operation, or call his room, and who answers the phone? Hello. Studs? Rick, Rick, I'm a medical miracle. A medical miracle, do you hear me? I go, well, I'm just glad you sound pretty good. You sound okay. No, I'm the oldest man ever to have a redo of a bypass. I go, okay, that's great. You gotta write about this. It'll save lives. It'll save people's lives. I thought, oh, I don't usually write about my friends. Well, actually, I do, but who cares? And this year in the newspapers, that's all I should write about are friends of mine, frankly. So I make some calls. I was to his doctor, who was just like, Top Gun heart surgeon, Marshall Golden. And I say, Marshall, is this true? Rick, I haven't heard. I'll make some calls for you. So Marshall called around the country and determined, to the best of our ability and worthy of being printed in the Tribune, that Studs was indeed by 5 years the oldest person to have a redo of a 10-year-old bypass at 93 in the country. And Marshall was like, well, technology's gotten better and everything's gotten better. I said, well, that's still an amazing kind of story. So I wrote it, and the next morning, come to the bus stop where I usually met this African-American woman every morning at 6:30, and she's standing there and she's crying. And I go, Betty, what's wrong? Oh, Rick, your old friend Stud Turco, I'm so sorry that he died. I said, no, he died. He's a medical miracle. I saw him yesterday. I wrote about him. Rick, you're in the bad denial. They don't put no 93-year-old on the front page of the paper if he didn't die. I go, well, I'm telling you, I'm going to the hospital later today to get him out of there. And I finally convinced her that he had not died. I said, read the story. You'll see it's not about... I know he's your friend, so I just want... That's why I was so sad this morning. So I went to the hospital that afternoon. Studs' son is kind of not in the picture and sort of in the picture. They have a complicated relationship. So I went to pick him up. And, he's got like 10 nurses going, oh, do you have to leave? Never heard nurses say this. You really have to go? Why do you have to go? Well, I'll be back. I'm sure I'll be back. Maybe I'll have this redone in another 10 years. It was great. It couldn't have been a better stay. Couldn't have been a better operation. And so we're leaving, and there's a line that I will always remember too. We walk outside. It's a day exactly like this, a beautiful blue sky. And we walk outside, and the one question, shitty reporter that I am, I never asked him, how do you feel? So I did. I said, Studs, how do you feel? And he looked up at the sky, and he looked around, and he said, Rick, I feel interested in life again. Interested in life. That was a moving moment for me. I'm surprised I could even keep pushing the wheelchair. But so that's Studs and Fiona. That is my favorite picture. I was just about to say when and if I die. Good luck with that, Rick. If this image were in my head at that moment, fine, it'd be great. Let me see if I can close this. Here.
How many of those shirts did he own?
Pardon me?
How many of those shirts did he own?
About a dozen. His wife, what happened was in the mid-50s, Studs married a beautiful, wonderful woman named Ida, who was Rick. And he always would say this. There were things that Studs said during his life like 100 and 1,000 times. Rick, I got lucky I married an older woman. I was making 22, a rich older woman. I was making $15 a week and she was making $17.50. And they stayed married until her death a few years ago, about 5 or 6 years before Studs, when everybody thought that would be it, because she did everything for him. She bought his clothes. And he came back, they were at a party, and he started commenting on it. I like that. I wasn't there, of course. I like that check shirt that man was wearing. It's a nice look. So Ida went out and bought like 5 check shirts. He settled on red. And that was his red check shirt, blue blazer, dark slacks, mostly loafers for the rest of his life. That was his outfit. Red sweater if it was cold and he was wearing a sweater. And Ida, when she was alive, I spent a lot of time over at that house, especially after my father died. And I said, Ida, why did you guys come up with this? And she goes, oh, Rick, darling, if I didn't dress him, he'd be dressed in rags. He didn't care much about sartorial kind of things. Let's play. Here's a good one. This is, if I can get it. Here is Studs, and I'll cut it off, but you should see some of this. Because the back of my head is in one of them. This is when, and I don't remember the year, they named the Division Street Bridge for Studs. That is certainly not it. Computer genius, how about it? I'll try to get you the good parts. You will see the back of my head next to the back of Royko's head. Hold on.
You know that man across this land.
He stuck with me in the hard old days.
That's me.
He never
That's Royko.
cared if I had no dough. We ran around in the rain and snow in Chicago town.
It's a great song, I love this song.
And that's Richard M. Daley and Royko.
You know that man across this land is your land. I bless you all. You're the people.
Here's his speech.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, fellow Chicagoans. Identification simply proves if you live long enough, anything can happen. I was thinking, when I first came here from the Big Apple, New York, at 8 years old, shortly after Warren Harding was elected president. 6 months after, I remember the night I came with a balmy summer evening. I had asthma. I was afflicted with asthma all my life while living my first 8 years in New York. And that night there was a strong south wind blowing from Stockyards. And that night my asthma was cured. So I prefer Chicago to the Big Apple. This particular bridge is a Chicago bridge. It's a bridge of working people. For Chicago has been primarily a blue-collar city. And so whenever I'll see that bridge going up to allow some iron ore coming into the Wasabi Range in Minnesota, I'll feel good. Whenever that bridge going up, when some paper is coming from the mills of Canada, I'll feel good. Whenever the bridge goes up and cargo, industrial necessities carried, I'll feel good. But if a single sailboat goes through with a high mast, will crew a yuppie couple at the cocoa can, never! Well, this is Chicago bridge. And there's one more thing to be said about this bridge. Named after the honor, by the way, there's fire. I must be frank about fire too much. Because there are people, writers and chronicles of city history, who can't have streets and alleys and boulevards and parkways named after them. We have more bridges than Paris does. Paris was a city, far more, but Paris does have avenues called Rue Victor Hugo, Rue Emile Zola, bridges after writers and others who knew the alleys and honor the alleys and the back streets as well as the boulevards. So I see someday Chicago Street called Nelson Auburn Avenue, or Michael Waco Parkway, or James T. Farrell Boulevard, or Gwendolyn Brooks Terrace, because in a sense it is those writers who respect, to follow the credo of Nelson Auburn, respect what's behind the billboards as well as in front of them. And so I feel very honest. And I said, I think this is much too much, but I'll take it nonetheless. And I thank
Isn't that great? Did you hear that?
Why isn't there a Mike Royal Parkway?
They tried. That's a very interesting question you asked there, young lady. After Mike died, there was a movement afoot by people who didn't know but admired Mike to have a street name for him. They couldn't get any traction in the. It was then in this. It was either the 42nd or 2nd ward near the Tribune. So they decided what they would do is name the staircase that goes down from the west side of Michigan Avenue to the Billy Goat, Mike Royko Way. Judy, Mike's widow, strenuously objected to that because I love Judy, but she was often in denial about Mike's considerable drinking. There's a great clip. Mike was interviewed by Studs a number of times. Like every time one of his collections would come out, he would interview him. So there's some great Royko stuff on there too. Let me play you. Here's a guy. I'll tell you a good story. I think. I don't know if any of these stories are any good. That one. There was a famous union steelworker down when we had steel mills down there named Ed Sadlowski. And he was a tough negotiator, but he was beloved by the people for whom he negotiated. And my girlfriend, who of 9 years, it's no fleeting thing, works still as an organizer for the Chicago Teachers Union. And Ed Sadlowski's daughter ran for alderman of the 10th Ward. She was a special education, Sue was her name, special education teacher in the public schools. And that's an uphill fight because John Pope was what we used to call kind of a machine alderman who was kind of entrenched down there. Sue's last name is Garza. She married a guy from Mexico. So, my little Kathy Murray, blonde, is knocking on doors before the election. She's electioneering, saying, hey, I'd like to give you some information about Sue Garza. And she says that any number of times, and the people that still live in the 10th Ward, it's a fascinating area of Chicago, but there would be an old guy, not a young Latino, but an old guy would open the door and, what do you need? I'm just passing out some literature for the woman running for alderman of the 10th Ward. What's her name? Garza. I'm not gonna vote for no Mexican. What are you, nuts? Saying this to my cute little girlfriend. And Kate would then say, well, but this is Ed Sadlowski's daughter. She said that they would go, oh my God, Ed Sadlowski, I owe him this house. I owe him our place in Lake Geneva. Honey, come here. It's Ed Sadlowski's daughter. And Kate would say, no, I'm not his daughter. It's the friend of Ed Sadlowski's daughter. Get out of bed and come over here. Sue won by 11 votes. Isn't that something? And she's a very good, she's being a very good, to my mind, anything anti-Rahm Emanuel is very good. Not a fan. And Ed now lives in Florida, and he's kind of, addled up here. Not the same astonishing speaker that he once was. But here he is talking to Studs. I don't know what year this is, and this is very short. I think it's a couple minutes, but you'll get a sense. And this is the other great thing about this archive, is you can literally relive some of Chicago's history by listening.
Of workers. We started really believing in that Calvinistic concept of pull yourself up by the bootstraps and reap what you sow, and individualism. This has always been a country of individualism. You've had that instilled in you, and that then And unfortunately, there's a whole generation, from my view, that really literally believes that crap and that, that they don't rely on their fellow man. They have no, they have no concept as far as their need or their fellow man's need for them. I see a lot of kids that they have no sense of history, no sense of yesterday, no sense of understanding. That's not to say that they're bad kids. That's not to say that they won't get religion when it's needed. A lot of those kids that work downtown, for example, think that they, can climb that ladder all by themselves, and that the rungs aren't going to be greased, and they're in for a rude awakening. I mean,
As you say that, I always tell the story, but it's true. I wait for a bus. It's uptown, but it's the high-rises, yuppie-esque, middle-class couples working downtown at agencies, commodities, and it was the day before Labor Day, or the work day before Labor Day. And I say, Labor Day coming up, a celebration of union. This couple of we hate unions. So I said, how many hours a day do you work? And it goes into the 40-hour week.
Right.
I said, how come you don't work 80 hours?
Right.
And there was no knowledge of their present circumstance.
I agree with
the
you.
role unions played.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
And still continue to play. I mean, with the labor movement, if I could make a pitch, and I've been as critical of the labor movement as the next guy, but in a sense I'd like to believe of what they don't do in relation to what they should do, and that, and with all its warts and all its frailties and all its ups and downs and that, and all my differences with some of the hierarchy and that, it's still the only institution that I know of in the history of this country that went out of its way over a period of 100 years to elevate the masses and to make it a better way of life and that, and it still is. It's still the only institution that I know that continuously talks about, good social change questions, medical care for everybody, and it's in the forefront of that. It fumbles the ball on occasion, it stumbles and what have you, but it sure beats the hell out of bankers' attitudes.
Truer words never spoken. The Tribune is currently in the midst of a sort of labor organizing effort. Yes?
Before this gets away, before the movie before, Studs talked about the fire at back of the arts. I lived in the back of the arch when the fire started, and it went on forever.
Well, I bet.
Yeah. In fact, you could tell what a good day was going to be which way the wind was
No
blowing.
question down there.
But when it did burn, it went on forever. And I remember, and I was probably only 5 at the
Yeah,
time,
sure.
But I remember it was either you, Mike, or even Studs who wrote a big article about the death of Chicago, not the fire. That the fire was going to be the death of Chicago.
Wow. I don't think it was me. It could have been Mike. Because Studs didn't write a lot for the newspaper, certainly. And I want to end. Have you enjoyed this at all? I've never done this before. I've never read this before. It has to do with my dad and sort of with Studs. I'm going to show you. You must admit, I'm not bad with this thing. My thanks to you guys. Studs, one of his best-selling books was titled The Good War, and in it he interviewed all manner of people. People who fought, people who stayed at home during World War II. One of those people he interviewed was my father. There are a couple of bad words in here, but it's 2018, who's going to be offended? And my father never, ever swore in front of me. And these are not the worst words ever, and they're just a couple of them. And he's quoting someone else most of the time. This is what my father, let me get this picture up of him. He's talking about going to war. 1943, I wound up in the Marine Corps, last place I thought I'd be. When I was 12, all the kids in my neighborhood joined the Boy Scouts. My parents refused to let me. They said, once you're in khaki, you never get out. I tried to join the service in 1942. Because I was a newspaper man, I was considered essential for the war effort and exempt. But I showed up at the draft board one night, Here were all these people sitting around trying to get deferred. I said to the stern old legionnaire, I'd like to have my status changed. Why? You're 3A, you're exempt. I said, I want to be 1A. I want to join the Marines. And within weeks, I was on my way to boot camp. Paris Island, soul of the world. Why? Well, I was definitely a non-macho character, but this was right after Guadalcanal and Marines were getting slaughtered all over the place. I wasn't caught up in any kind of patriotic fervor, though I did want to fight Hitler. I was 30. I wore glasses. Everyone else was 17 or 18. Though I knew I'd eventually be a Marine Corps correspondent, I went through the 10 weeks, long marches, drill, the whole thing. My drill instructor, a guy with a big gut, was in the traditional mold. Profane, vile, and insulting. One night he called me, beer can in hand. I want to talk to you man to man. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. I see by these here that you supposed to go to Washington to be a combat correspondent. What the is that? As I understand it, sir, you write about the men in your outfit. He stared at me. He flung the papers on his bed and they flew in all directions. What are you gonna do? Fight the war with a pencil? No, sir. You shoot first, then you take notes. He kept staring. You ain't gonna fight the war with no pencil. I'm gonna countermand these orders. I knew that a general had signed the orders and this guy was a corporal. But then there was a hint of a smile on his face. I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. You look like a nice guy, but I bet you deep down you're an awful prick. He beamed. What could I do? He said, yeah, I want you to stay here and be a drill instructor. You'd make a good drill instructor because you look like a nice guy, but I think deep down you're a prick. The fat face, those beady eyes just beaming. I was a drill instructor for the next 3 weeks. Fast forward, April 1st, 1945, Okinawa, war correspondent. I was scared stiff so very often. I remember being under attack and spending the night in a foxhole with a young lieutenant from Oklahoma City. As fate would have it, on the following night, I was elsewhere to follow up on another story. Otherwise, I'd have been with him again. While I was away, he had his legs blown off. There was a sense of pride at having been in the Marine Corps. The one thing I carried away with me was the selflessness of some of those kids with no great philosophical ideas about war or comradeship. Sorry. I've often wondered what would have happened to me if I'd never gone into the service. Would I have been a newspaper executive? Had I not been in, had I not met some of those kids, I might have become a University of Chicago intellectual snob. But I could have done without the experience. No matter how just a war is, it was war. It was never a solution to anything. War. On that charming note, thank you.